Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event. I'm Kate Easton from the Lit and Phil, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'd like to welcome our speaker tonight, Ian McArdle, a very familiar face to us all, I'm sure. He's one of our most versatile lecturers, and he's given lectures on many subjects, from aspects of the First World War to Thomas the Tank, the creator of that series of stories, to the life of L.S. Lowry. He is a long-standing member of the Lit and Phil and is a very active volunteer. So please join with me to welcome Ian McArdle, who tonight is going to be talking about Agatha Christie. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Agatha, she wrote about mysteries, and she herself is something of a mystery in, at least, it seems to me, two ways. She loved the good life, self-indulgent, comfort, but at the same time, she showed enormous creativity and energy. 78 crime novels and about 150 short stories, 19 plays. Her sales to date are at least 2 billion in at least 100 languages, including Chinese, Russian, and Arabic. And it's been said of Christie has probably given more pleasure in bed than any other woman. I hope you see what I mean. So there is one contrast already, the sybaritic life she loved, but her talent, her ability to work so hard and intensively. And a second contradiction in her character, which makes her very difficult to sum up, I think, is that everybody has heard, of course, of Agatha Christie, but at the same time, she was a very shy and private woman. And the more famous she became, the more she retreated into her own private world, intensely disliking public occasions. She says in her autobiography, "Inarticulate I shall always be. It's probably one of the causes that has made me a writer." She was born into a secure, loving family. Her father, Frederick Miller, American by birth, was a lovable but rather indolent man who preferred spending his time on the golf course rather than looking after business interests. And he managed to lose most of the inherited fortune that he had received from his grandfather. And what a contrast he must have made with Agatha's mother, Clara. Clara was the unwanted child, the last of 4 children. She wasn't brought up really by her mother, but by her mother's sister, who Agatha therefore called not Granny, but Auntie Granny, although she also got on quite well with her real granny. But Agatha's mother, Clara, then was brought up by her aunt, and as a child she had been quiet and restrained. But as she grew up, she began to see the world in terms of melodrama, thoughts darting through her brain like swallows in flight. She had a powerful creative imagination and intuition, and Agatha, I hardly need say, would inherit those traits to the full. Probably only her mother really understood her. She had a very close relationship with her mother, but she also allowed Agatha great freedom. For example, in 1911, she was allowed to take her first flight in one of those so-called aeroplanes. Agatha was brought up really in a matriarchy, that it was the women who were the powerful decision makers. Her own mother, Auntie Granny, who I've mentioned, Sister Madge, and the domestic servants, most of whom were women. So she had a sister and a brother, elder sister Madge, the lively, beautiful, successful one, who would go on to marry very well, and a brother, Agatha was the youngest of the 3. Her brother, Monty, the problematic, difficult one, a bit of a waster, who died tragically young of an overdose. But in those years, at the end of the 19th century, life in Devon, Torquay, where she was born, must have been very pleasant, growing up in an upper middle class household, security and comfort all around her. She grew up in Ashfield, that you can see here, a large Italian-style stucco villa on the edge of Torquay. It was a wonderfully peaceful atmosphere, I imagine, in those years of Edwardian serenity. And there were many distinguished visitors at the time, Henry James, Rudyard Kipling, and they indicate the family's social standing at the time. Now, don't try to visit Ashfield now, because this is all you will see. It was built originally on the outskirts of Torquay, but was demolished I think it was in the 1960s when the house was demolished. There were lavish meals, no money was spared. Here's a description of a dinner party for 10 people, to which I imagine Agatha was invited. Start with thick or clear soup, then fillet of sole, sorbet, saddle of mutton, lobster mayonnaise, pudding diplomatique, trifle, sweets, and then dessert. All of this produced single-handedly by Jane the cook, Jane who ruled the kitchen with the calm superiority of a queen, a large, gentle cow, everlastingly chewing the cud, is Agatha's charming description. Now, little Agatha as a girl was probably a charming little girl, but I think she was a bit greedy as well. When offered a plate of peaches and asked which one would she like, she replies, "I should like the biggest and the bestest." She seems to have a weakness for chocolates and cream. I pushed in mouthfuls of cream and coffee icing. I ought to have looked like a pig by now, instead of which I had a most ethereal appearance, fragile and thin with large, dreamy eyes, as you can see in this old photograph. A charming, secure environment for a child to grow up in, yes. But like any child, she had fears and concerns. One of those was a character, an 18th century soldier in her mind, who she called the gunman, perhaps what we used to call the bogeyman. And I want you to remember this, not a nightmare, just this ill feeling of concern that she felt sometimes about a mysterious figure who could appear in the familiar disguise of one of your close friends or relatives. Please remember the gunman, because he will appear later on. She was also a rather solitary child, I think, probably the mother's influence, because she didn't want Agatha mixing with the rough kids in the neighbourhood. And so Agatha falls back on her own power of imagination. In her large garden at Ashfield, she imagines there are 3 railways. They have names, the tubular, the tub, and the terrace. And I can see her chuffing around the imaginary rails on one of her 3 railways. She didn't have many girlfriends, so what does she do? She invents them, and she gives them funny names. There's one called Poodle, and one called Squirrel, and one called Tree. She invents kittens, and interestingly, Agatha herself acts out as one of them. She acts as if she was one of the kittens. She could get inside her characters, her kittens. She invented, as many little girls do, a school. And she had, as I said before, this ability to get inside the characters. There were 4 main schoolgirls, Ethel, Annie, Elsie, and Isabel, who she didn't like. So when she played the part of Isabel, she made Isabel lose at all the games. Education, well, sort of an education, but not a very conventional one. She wasn't sent to school, but she taught herself to read by deciphering the signs on shop windows and on the awnings of buildings as well. Much to Nanny's worry. Nanny came to Mummy one day and saying, I'm dreadfully sorry, ma'am, said Nursey to mother. Miss Agatha can read. How dreadful. Agatha's mother thought it was better to wait, but Agatha didn't, until you're about 8 years old. Better for your eyes, better for your brain. She also took music lessons and became, in fact, an accomplished pianist and dancing lessons. And they spent a very enjoyable year in the south of France in the town of Pau, where she must have learned very good French. But then in 1900, at the turn of the century, dark shadows began to fall over this secure, serene household in Torquay. Her father was suffering from failing health, probably linked to his financial problems. And the following year, I'm afraid, he died. And fortunes changed very, very rapidly indeed. When they looked into just how the financial accounts stood, they were in dire straits. Agatha and her mother were now more or less on their own. Things, Agatha says in her autobiography, things seemed the same, but the atmosphere was different. I knew for the first time what it was to feel anxiety for other people. Elder sister Madge has married brilliantly and moved north to Cheshire, not however before filling in Agatha on the facts of life. Now this might be new for you lot. Apparently, as you probably know, babies come out of your tummy button, to which your mother holds the key when you are born. But when you marry and get a husband, your mummy gives your husband the key, and when you want to have babies, he unlocks your navel and out pops the baby. At least this was Madge's explanation of how babies are born. Agatha is growing up, and she's a very attractive young woman. And in Torquay, there is still a social round for this very gregarious girl, but it's on a much reduced scale. All right, there's the Torquay Regatta and the odd party of theatricals, a meeting of the South Devon Hunt, but there was much less social interchange than previously. However, there were masses of books to read, including detective fiction, and Agatha delves into Conan Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, Wilkie Collins, and becomes very familiar with the genre. As a teenager, she did go to school for 2 days a week to Miss Gaia's private school in Torquay, where she learned arithmetic, grammar and composition, which I imagine she was very good. And then in the middle of all of this, her mother, acting very spontaneously, and Agatha go off to Paris, where Agatha tries out 3 different schools for her education, but the final one is a big success. There are visits to the theatre and talks to quite famous actors and actresses. She says that these were some of the happiest days that she ever knew when she was introduced into French society. She was now, in 1906, beginning to take growing pleasure in her own attractiveness as a young woman. However, she remained terribly tongue-tied in the company of young men. I mentioned she was an accomplished pianist and also a singer, but her dreadful shyness, I'm afraid, put pay to any hope of her following a career in those directions. She was just too shy to perform well in public, and her voice was not really strong enough for opera. She was, however, given by her mother the opportunity to come out when young women were presented to fashionable society, but not in London, too expensive, but in Cairo, which was not unusual. There was, of course, a large Anglo-Egyptian society in Cairo, and she spent 3 months in Cairo, as she puts it, on the prowl for a young man. And she worked hard at it, 5 dances every week, and she managed to more or less overcome her awkwardness. And she had at least 2 quite serious proposals of marriage. And then they returned to England. And in 1912, sorry, I should have shown you that picture of her, but you can see she's a very attractive young woman. In 1912, they return to England, and she goes to a dance at Ugbrook House near Exeter in October 1912, and she meets a certain Archie Christie, who has apparently he's a film star. He has film star good looks. He's a bit of a Byronic character, a fiery person. He's a second lieutenant in the Royal Field Artillery, but wants to become a pilot and will, when war breaks out, join the Royal Flying Corps. Not perhaps the healthiest of occupations. They meet at a dance, and they both fall helplessly in love almost immediately, much to the disgust of Agatha's mother. Well, after all, he has poor prospects, and he has no money to speak of. And for 2 years, Agatha's mother puts up a bitter fight against Agatha developing the relationship with Archie Christie. They are 2 years of tears and struggle and separation. And then her mother, as it were, gives in, and they are married with 1 day's notice on Christmas Eve, 1914, Agatha being now 24. Agatha likes to take risks and does things very often impetuously on the spur of the moment. But what an odd wedding it was, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't bother to inform Agatha's own mother. Agatha is married in Archie's local church. It costs £8 for the license. Agatha just turns up in her street clothes. The organist just happened to be practicing at the time, and the witness was just a pal who was walking by in the street as it chanced at the time. They then, because war, of course, has broken out, they have a 1-day honeymoon in a Torquay hotel, and until 1918, Agatha will only see Archie rarely on leave, and must, I imagine, have been terribly, terribly worried about the perilous life that her new husband was leading. Agatha, however, doesn't go home to Ashfield and mope. Oh no, she continues to live at Ashfield with mother and Auntie Granny. But she takes up war work, and I've got a picture of her here in her VAD, the voluntary attached detachment nurse. She took up VAD nursing in a Torquay hospital. She didn't get on very well with the nursing, so she moved sideways to the hospital's dispensary, where she acquired, quite a good knowledge of poisons, which, as you know, will come in quite useful. Archie, and this tells us something about Archie's very impractical outlook on life, Archie wasn't happy with Agatha working at all. He wanted a wife who was beautiful and carefree, untroubled by the woes of the world. So it sounds not altogether a recipe for a successful relationship. But what's all this got to do with Agatha as a writer? Well, from being a little girl, she had enjoyed writing, and in fact, her very first literary attempt, for which she won a prize from the Poetry Review, was printed in 1901. It was a poem printed in an Ealing, West London, newspaper. And she'd played around with songs and little stories, even with a novel full of incest, of all things. And she got simply into the habit, as many youngsters do, of writing stories, just, I suppose, as others satisfy their creative urge through embroidery or painting. Well, Agatha satisfied hers through writing. And then she found, with the stress and the boredom of war work, she found she could find solace and consolation in writing. And she turns to the idea of writing a mystery based on a novel way of administering poison. She's spurred on by big sister Madge, by the way, who's also had a certain amount of success in the literary field. Well, she toyed around with the idea, and one day, lying in bed, recovering from a bout of flu, complaining of being bored, her mother said, "Well, why don't you write a story just like Madge? And of course, if Big Sister can do it, I can do it as well." And you know what? So she did. She decided on a detective story. Now, what about the process? She'd have to decide who should be poisoned. Question one, who? When should it happen? And where should it take place? In Agatha, and this is important, I think, to see inside the mind of a great writer, Agatha talked her work aloud. And she played out the parts in her head in imagined scenes, just, of course, as she had done with her make-believe kittens and girls when she'd been just a little girl. And she says that she went on playing with the idea. Now, the murderer, he should be rather sinister looking. Sure enough, the next day she sees just what she wants. She sees what she wants. A man with a black beard sitting next to an elderly lady who was chattering away like a magpie. Behind them, a large, hearty woman. I'll have her as well. And she grabs the characters. She puts them on one side to develop and turns to her detective. She remembers that there were quite a lot of Belgian refugees in Torquay in the First World War. So why not make the detective a Belgian? Now, he would be small, meticulous, very tidy, and very brainy. A name. Well, what about Hercule Poirot? Now, I don't know, but Poirot might be a play on words because Poirot in French, although it's not spelt the same, means a leek, the vegetable a leek. I don't know. So the book gets underway. To finish the book, Agatha's mother packs her off to a hotel on Dartmoor. And as she walked, she muttered to herself, speaking as John, one of the characters in the book, speaking as John to Mary or as Mary to John. She took on the persona of her characters. She got quite excited with this way of working. She would come home, have dinner in the hotel, fall into bed, sleep for 12 hours, and then get up and write passionately. Remember that creative energy she has, write passionately again all morning. And book one is produced. It's called, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And it's promptly rejected by Hodder and Stoughton and then by Methuen. Forget it, Agatha, you're not going to be a writer. The war approaches its end. Archie returns sometime before the end and he works at the Air Ministry. And I ask you here a series of questions. Would Agatha ever have become a writer if her husband didn't have the soul of a stockbroker, if he hadn't become addicted to golf, if he had been a more responsive partner, if he hadn't been given the opportunity to fall in love with another woman, if he and Agatha had had more children? Maybe if she'd had a happy relationship, she'd have been content with domestic life and the world would be a poorer place because of it. Chance is a great thing. Well, anyway, her daughter, her only child, Rosalind, is born in 1919. She's born at Ashfield. Agatha, though, isn't perhaps a perfect mother. She doesn't really feel like a mother. She feels like a girl who's come home after an exciting but rather tiring party. Archie thinks at first this might drive a further wedge between them, the arrival of the daughter, but in fact it brings the family for a time closer together. But Agatha was never a sentimental mother, and Rosalind, the daughter, got on, in fact, better with her father than with her mother. She thinks an honest mother would simply treat her offspring as a cat does, take satisfaction in giving birth, nurture for a while, and then move back into her own life. which she largely did with the help of secretaries and nannies and other people like that. They take a flat in London, and I don't know how they did it because they had no money, but they still managed to have a batman and a caretaker who did for them. Money was always tight, but they always splashed it around. Agatha, never idle, took a course in bookkeeping and shorthand typing. And there was no writing really for about 2 years when, out of the blue in 1919, a contract for her first book falls on the doormat, a contract with the Bodley Head publishing company. And the book, of course, was this, The Mysterious Affair of Styles, we mentioned before. And Agatha really, well, you need to read the small print on the contract. I don't think she did. She was so gobsmacked by being offered publication. She didn't really read the contract, which wasn't a very good one. And I think she was taken for a bit of a ride. She was tied in for a commitment of 5 books. She received no royalty for this first book and only £25 for some serial rights. But at least it was a start, and it got her name before the public. Financial pressures press on them. It's Archie who suggests she try to write another book, and so she does. And she produces the second book. It's quite a different one, with a couple, Tommy and Tuppence, who are 2 sleuths, recently demobbed soldiers, down on their luck. Pretty common in post-war Britain, of course. She wrote it really just to try to keep the pot boiling, to keep her name in front of the public. And in fact, Tommy and Tuppence appear in 5 of her books, including the very last one. Well, it actually sells quite well, and she gets 50 quid for the book, which isn't bad. And she says, well, it was encouraging, but not encouraging enough to make me think I had as yet anything so grand as writing as a profession. She writes out of the 3rd book, A Murder on the Links, which is well received, and she writes some short sketches featuring Poirot. And then, just when she's got a foot on the ladder, she and Archie take another risk and they throw it all up, as it were. In 1921 and 1922, a Major Belcher, what a name, is given the job of organising the British Empire Exhibition Mission to promote the exhibition of 1924. Basically, it's a money-raising exercise amongst politicians and businessmen from the Dominions. Belcher seems to have been a very interesting character who had bluffed himself into the position during the war of controller of potatoes, although he knew nothing about potatoes. He relies on competent seconds in command, and Archie is chosen to fulfill this role as the financial controller of the mission, which sounds very nice. There'll be speech making and dinners and luncheons around the world, South Africa, Australia, Canada, all expenses paid, at least for Archie. Despite the risks, Archie gives up his job, and the couple leave Rosalind at Ashfield with Agatha's mother. But these 10 months were probably the high point of the marriage. On the return part of it, we can see them in Canada looking very happy with each other. Agatha went, partly because it was an exciting but risky thing to do, because she had heeded her mother's advice. If you leave him, your husband, if you leave him too much, you'll lose him. A wife ought to be with her husband. And if she isn't, then he feels he has a right to forget her. Well, I don't know if you agree or disagree with this. Well, it's a marvellous trip, although there's highs and lows. Agatha's a dreadful traveller. She suffers dreadfully from seasickness, and a woman in a cabinet opposite her one morning says to the steward, "Is the lady in the cabin opposite dead yet?" Agatha was so ill. They run out of money in New York and survive by stuffing themselves at breakfast in the hotel, which is included in the price, and then living on hot water and what we would call bovril or marmite for their other meals. They have the first experience of a cafeteria. Apparently, you take a tray, you help yourself, and you pay at the end. It'll never catch on, however, never catch on. They return to England. Archie, both of them find it difficult at first, of course, and she still makes it clear to us she had no idea of writing as a profession, although her name was already quite well known. She writes a fourth book, The Man in the Brown Suit, which is about their exploits on this marvelous trip they have taken. And the years up to 1926 bring eventually financial success for Agatha and for Archie. Her publishers now begin to appreciate her talent, as I'm afraid does the Inland Revenue, with whom she has lots of fights throughout her life, in fact. It was by now, she says, just beginning to dawn on me that perhaps I might be a writer by profession. They buy a house in Berkshire, which they call Styles. The house is still there, by the way, and they spend money as if there's no tomorrow, despite still not being that well off. But they still seem to manage to live a very high lifestyle indeed. And then in 1926 comes out her first real masterpiece, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and she moves into the forefront of British detective story writers. Bodley Head Publishing are rejected, and she enters a long-term relationship with Collins. She stays with them for many years. And life looks so good and rosy. All was for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But 1926 was also the fateful year. The next year of my life, she says, 1926, was the one that she hates recalling. And to be honest, she doesn't recall it in her autobiography. There were ominous signs that things weren't going well. Weekends were dull. She wants to invite friends, or she wants to play golf. They begin to lead to parallel existences. And Archie is reluctant to discuss literary ideas. He's really a very little support to Agatha. And then in the same year, Agatha's mother dies, the person probably she was closest to in the world. Agatha leaves Dangerous, leaves Styles to go down to Torquay to shut up the house, though they don't sell the house. She neglects Archie and she sinks into depression. And it's on Rosalind's 7th birthday in August that Archie travels down to Torquay to celebrate the birthday, but also to announce that he wishes to seek divorce from Agatha. For a year, Agatha puts up fierce resistance, hoping things will change. And to some extent, she blames herself, silly woman, for not heeding her mother's advice. Archie, in other words, has become the gunman of her childhood, somebody she thought she knew so well, and yet, in fact, he was a stranger to her. The next events are the ones that everybody seems to know about Agatha Christie. However, we can't be absolutely sure what happened. We know she disappeared, and the Surrey police had a job on their hands, but the files were destroyed in a bombing raid in the Second World War. It goes something like this. She leaves a letter for her secretary and possibly one for Archie before disappearing. The contents of the letters are interpreted by the police as a possible suicide note. She drives away from Styles quite late at night. She has a minor collision and abandons the car in a quarry at Newlands Corner near Guildford. She may have suffered concussion, but somehow or other, possibly by the milk train, she makes her way to London, then on to Harrogate, to the spa town, where she can hide away, as I imagine she thinks. and she holds up for 10 days in the Harrogate Hydropathic, now the Old Swan Hotel, who are very welcoming and have some quite interesting information about Agatha's stay at the time there. The press, of course, get on to this. Her picture is splashed all over the paper, and gradually suspicions arise in the hotel of this mysterious woman. She's finally recognized by a banjo player in the band. Archie is informed. He comes to collect her, and they go back to London, where she undergoes hypnosis. Maybe she suffered from amnesia, or what was called hysterical fugue, where you just block out events that you cannot bear to remember. The consequences, of course, were extremely serious. The police spent great sums of money searching the Downs and dragging pawns at great cost. The press, of course, would you imagine, have a field day. Archie at first is the grieving lover, but then in the eyes of the press he becomes an adulterer, and then the prime suspect in a possible murder case. But they don't leave Agatha alone. Was it just a hoax theory to get revenge on an unfaithful husband? But she says it was from this time that her revulsion against the press dates, her dislike of journalists and of crowds. Styles is sold. She and Agatha move into a house in Chelsea. Money is tight, and Agatha understands that writing is the possible solution to her problems. That was the moment, and this is perhaps the watershed in her life. That was the moment when I changed from an amateur to a professional. But she recovers, helped by loyal friends. She writes a couple of pot boilers to keep her name in front of the public. And in 1928, she, almost on the spur of the moment, takes on her own a trip to the Middle East, armed with a list of introductions and invitations. And it turns out to be a wonderful trip. The lure of the past came to meet her, and she was able to put her own problems in some perspective. She travels alone on the Orient Express, and then on by train to Aleppo and Damascus, and by bus over the desert to Baghdad. The journey probably safer then than it would be now, but still not very safe. And she visits the ancient city of Ur at the invitation of Leonard Woolley, who is a very eminent archaeologist. He and his wife Catherine make her most welcome, and she is inspired by the desert and by the archaeology there. She returns to Great Britain, but she's lured back in 1930, a second trip to the Middle East, and back to Ur, where this time Leonard Woolley introduces her to his assistant, one Max Malone, Oxford educated, a classicist, tireless worker, a highbrow, in contrast to little old Agatha, who's a lowbrow. And Max was instructed by the Woolleys to take Agatha on a tour to the principal sites of the region on her way back to Baghdad, and Agatha responded with great enthusiasm to the Arabian landscape. Trip has its moments. The two of them have to sleep in a prison cell, that being the safest place, and she's led by Max to the privies in the middle of the night. They go swimming together in their underwear. The car breaks down in the middle of the desert. Agatha doesn't panic. She takes it all in her stride. And on the way home in Athens, Agatha very badly sprains her ankle just when she's received news that her daughter is very ill with pneumonia. Max, who was to have left her in Athens, drops his plans, takes care of her, and accompanies her all the way back to London. She remembers little of the journey with Max, except his extraordinary kindness, tact, and sympathy. So that back home in London, she meets Max again and invites him as a friend down to Ashfield. He's, if the word is correct, entertained by long walks over a long rain-soaked Dartmoor. And then he comes to her room one night and proposes marriage, much to Agatha's astonishment. So she says, at least. But there would be grounds for that. He's 14 years younger. He's a Catholic, And these things were important to Agatha, who was a very sincere believer. And Max still, of course, has his way to make in the world. So what do you do in these circumstances? Well, of course, you consult your home oracle, i.e. your 12-year-old daughter, Rosalind. And Rosalind thinks Max would be an excellent choice. He'd be useful for sailing and tennis, and he gets on with her horrible little dog, Peter. You know, she said, when you're married to Max, you'll have to sleep in the same bed as him. I know, said Agatha. Well, yes, I suppose you did, said Rosalind, but I thought you might not have thought of it. I assured her I had thought of everything relevant to the occasion. And they're married very quietly in St Cuthbert's Church in Edinburgh. They fiddled the marriage certificate. She's actually 40 and he's 14 years younger, but on the marriage certificate, I think they're 32 for Max and 37 for Agatha. They even travelled back to London separately to avoid the eyes of the prying press. And we can see two pictures of them, not, I think, at their wedding, but looking in later years very happy with each other, taken no doubt some considerable time after the wedding. But then the years leading up to the Second World War were years of private happiness despite a miscarriage. Regular trips to the Middle East. They took a house, Bait, I think is the Arabic for a house, and Agatha would join in enthusiastically on digs while continuing her writing and Max continuing his career. She says she was gaining confidence in her writing by now. She felt she would have no difficulty in producing a book every year. The nice part about writing in those days was that I directly related it to money. This stimulated my output enormously. And she invents another character. In 1930, a Miss Marple appears for the first time in Murder in the Vicarage. Agatha can't remember when, where, or how I wrote it, why I came to write it, or even what suggested to me that I should select a new character. And certainly I had no intention of continuing her for the rest of my life. Miss Marple almost certainly bears some resemblance to Agatha's own grandmother. She usually expected the worst of everyone and everything, and was, with almost frightening accuracy, usually proved right. She begins to dabble in the theatre. Alibi, 1928, is the play produced from Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and three of her finest novels are produced in this period: Murder on the Orient Express, the ABC Murders, and Death on the Nile. There is considerable, that's putting it mildly, considerable financial success, partly due to American earnings. She buys, first of all, Winterbrook House in 1934, a delightful Queen Anne house with a garden, wall kitchen section, meadow sweeping down to the River Thames at Wallingford, just south of Oxford. The house, however, is private, so you can't visit it. The place some of you probably have visited, particularly if you're in the National Trust. She buys 4 years later, 1938, Greenway on the River Dart, a beautiful white Georgian house with woods sweeping down to the Dart. I've just got a few pictures from a fairly recent visit. The best way is to arrive by ferry. You walk up to the house, which is quite modest in all ways, isn't it? And there's a very opulent looking lounge and a rather splendid dining room as well. Ashfield is finally sold. And during the war years, her creativity continues unabated. One novel, Absent in the Spring, 50,000 words, is written in 3 days. That's all. She wrote to shut out the cold and the gloom, not only for herself, I suppose, but also for her thousands, if not millions, of readers as well. She does have serious tax problems, and she cannot receive her royalties from the United States. Both of those splendid houses we saw were requisitioned, Greenway by the American Army, who treated quite well. And she's also separated from her husband, Max, who works in what is nowadays, Cairo and Libya, Tripolitania then. So again, they are separated. It would not be an easy time. And this is where she lived for most of the time in London. The block of flats, I think, still exists in Hampstead. There were some shafts of light during those years. Her grandson Matthew was born in 1942, and he came to play an increasingly important part in her life. The son, perhaps, she never had. However, Rosalind's husband, Hugh, was killed in action, so Hugh had only seen his little son once or twice before he was killed. The saddest thing, says Agatha, in life, and the hardest to live through, is the knowledge there is someone you love very much whom you cannot save from suffering. Peace comes in 1945. Max returns after 3 years' absence. I heard the most peculiar clanking on the stairs. Presumably this was military paraphernalia he was carrying home with him. It was Max. Both of them now have middle age spread, but their love remains strong. What a wonderful evening it was. We ate burnt kippers and were happy. She gets Greenway back, which was reasonably well looked after by the American troops, although there were 40 lavatories lined up in the back corridor, which eventually she gets taken out at the army's expense. The garden is wild, but these things can be put right. And Max goes on in 1948 to become a professor at London University. So the 1950s were years of maturity and success and happiness. The financial position improves yet more with theatre, film, and later TV. She writes a short radio play called Three Blind Mice. And then it's turned into a play. You won't have heard of it. It's called, I think, The Mousetrap in 1952. So that it's in something like its 71st year now. Agatha very modestly says, it was successful. 90% of that was luck, says Agatha. She concedes it was well constructed and it has something for everybody. Critics think it'll run for a year. Nonsense, says Agatha. 8 months at most. How wrong she was. And yet she remains so modest. At the 10th anniversary of The Mousetrap, she turns up as guest of honour at the Savoy. She turns up early and she's met in the corridor by one of the porters who says, sorry, madam, who doesn't recognise her, sorry, madam, no entrance yet. 20 minutes before you can come in. So Agatha, instead of saying, don't you know who I am, simply says, I'm dreadfully sorry. And she is found wandering in the corridors of the Savoy by the party. She says that she supposes that the feeling is that she's pretending to be something I am not, because even now, I don't quite feel as if I am an author. So we come finally to the autumn of her life, her affairs. She begins to tidy up. She forms a company, Agatha Christie Limited. And so in her will, she actually only leaves about £100,000, having given most of her money away to trusts or to charities. And there is a lessening of effort, as there is for us all, as she gets older. And from a tax point of view, that's perfectly logical. In 1971, she was made a Dame of the British Empire. And she says, having reached the age of 75, it seemed the right moment to stop, because as far as life is concerned, that is all there is to say. I live now on borrowed time, waiting in the anteroom for the summons that will inevitably come. Well, I think she spoke a bit early, really, because she lived for another 10 years in a very energetic manner. She continues to make notes and think about new stories until the very end, almost. She keeps abreast with literary theory because she feels that Matthew, her grandson's, his first child, Alexandra, she must have an intelligent great-grandmother. And Agatha's last public appearance is at the premiere of the Albert Finney film version of Murder on the Orient Express. And you can, of course, visit her grave. It's at Chelsea, which is very near Didcot, or again, not far from Wallingford. Beautiful church, St. Mary's Church. Go around the back of the church, and there is the grave. Max would join her a few years later. They didn't spell his profession correctly, archaeologist. It's spelled wrongly. Have a read of it, because our last slide is the inscription that you can just now decipher, but weather is taking its toll on the inscription. I think it's a very apt way of concluding our little talk. Sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, ease after war, death after life, does greatly please. She had a great zest for life. She lived a full and highly successful life. I wish we could all claim the same. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian. As ever, a fantastically rich and detailed lecture describing the life of an icon, essentially. We all know who Agatha Christie is, but now we know much more about her than we previously did. Ian, I'd like to thank you again on behalf of the Little Phil and on behalf of everybody here tonight. And as I said, the talk will be put on our YouTube channel quite soon. This is a free talk, as many of our talks are free. And thank you to those of you who have already made a donation towards Little Phil funds. If you are moved to make a further donation or a new donation, please do check our website. You'll be able to do that via the website, or if you check our YouTube channel, you'll be able to contribute as well. But on that note, I shall conclude and say good night to everybody.